The summer of 1942 came to the banks of the Volga River with heat and dust and the taste of metal in the air. Stalingrad was not a beautiful city. It was not Paris or Rome or Berlin. It was a long strip of factories, workers' housing, warehouses, chimneys, and docks stretched along the western bank of the mighty river like a scar of brick and steel. It was smoke, noise, and iron. It was the beating industrial heart of the Soviet South. But it had something no other city had. It carried the name of the man who ruled the Soviet Union, Stalingrad. Stalin's city. To Hitler, that alone was enough reason to destroy it. By June 1942, the German Wehrmacht had been pushing into the Soviet Union for a year. They had smashed through Ukraine, taken Crimea, swallowed towns and cities with terrifying speed. Villages burned behind their lines. Millions were dead or captured. German propaganda said the Red Army was finished, broken, incapable of real resistance. But the war had not ended with the failure to take Moscow. It had shifted. Hitler's eyes turned south toward the oil fields of the Caucasus and the city on the Volga that blocked the way. If the Germans cut the Volga, they would cut a major artery of Soviet supply. If they took Stalingrad, they would take Stalin's pride, his name, his myth. So he gave the order. Army Group South pivoted toward the Volga. The 6th Army, under General Friedrich Paulus, and the 4th Panzer Army rolled east, advancing through fields and villages already crushed by war. As they came, the air filled with the drone of the Luftwaffe. The German war machine moved like a storm. In Moscow, in the Kremlin, maps spread across a long table. Stalin's pipe smoked in the haze of the command room. His generals stood stiffly, tracing red and blue arrows with shaking fingers. The line of German advance crawled closer to one word on the map: Stalingrad. In Stalingrad itself, life tried to continue, as if pretending the war might somehow stop at the city's edge. Workers still went to the factories. The great tractor factories stamped out T-34 tank hulls by night and repaired damaged machines by day. The Red October steel works roared with heat. Children went to school when they could. Women queued for bread that was thinner, smaller, and darker every week. They heard stories. They knew the front was approaching. But when you live through war long enough, stories feel like weather, always there, always dangerous, but distant, until it breaks over your head. One evening, a siren wailed in the middle of a shift at the factory. Another drill, people thought. Then someone shouted from the yard, "Planes!" The sky over the city darkened, not with clouds but with wings. On August 23, 1942, the Luftwaffe came to Stalingrad in force. German bombers, Heinkel He-111s, Junkers Ju-88s, Stukas filled the sky in wave after wave. Hundreds of planes, more than the people in the city thought the sky could hold. The first bombs fell on the oil storage tanks near the river. Flames shot into the air like torches from hell. The blast blew windows out across entire districts. Then the bombers turned inward. They struck the factories, the rail yards, the workers' districts. They struck the markets, the schools, the narrow streets filled with wooden houses. Incendiaries fell, igniting everything that would burn and many things that shouldn't. A firestorm was born. The air became heat. The streets became rivers of flame. People ran without knowing where to go. A tram full of passengers was hit directly. When the fire was finally out, the tram still stood on the tracks, full of blackened, fused bodies forever seated. The Volga reflected the burning city, turning the water into molten gold and black. Smoke rose in pillars that pierced the sky. The noise was beyond noise, one continuous roar of explosions and screaming metal. By the time the last bomber turned away, tens of thousands were dead. Entire neighborhoods were nothing but ash. Some blocks lost every house. Others had only chimneys standing like tombstones. Stalingrad had been turned from a city into ruins in a single day. And yet, from beneath the rubble, people crawled out. Covered in dust, in blood, in soot, blinking in the orange light of their burning home, the city had not died. Not yet. In the aftermath of the bombing, The Volga became both lifeline and wall. On the eastern bank, beyond the reach of the Luftwaffe's heaviest strikes, Soviet command set up depots and staging areas. Barges ferried reinforcements, ammunition, food, and wounded across the wide, slow river. Each crossing was a gamble. German planes and artillery rained shells onto the water. Boats burned. Men fell into the river and vanished, dragged under by the weight of their gear and the sucking current. But still, they came. Units from all over the Soviet Union, redirected to this gutted city. Siberians in white camouflage, Kazakhs unused to city streets, Ukrainians who had already seen too much death. Farm boys who had never seen a city at all before seeing this one wreathed in smoke. They arrived on the West Bank and found not a city, but a landscape of broken brick and twisted steel. Stalingrad had become a skeleton, and they were expected to live inside it. In late July, before the bombing, Stalin had already issued one of the most infamous orders of the war, Order Nr. 227. Not one step back. Retreat without orders was now a crime. Commanders who pulled back could be court-martialed. Soldiers who deserted could be shot. Behind some Soviet lines stood blocking detachments, NKVD troops whose job was not to fight the Germans, but to shoot anyone who ran. In Stalingrad, this order took on a new, brutal meaning. With the Volga at their backs and the Germans in front of them, there was nowhere to step back to. The only direction left was forward or down, into the ruins. General Vasily Chukov was given command of the 62nd Army, the battered force responsible for defending the city itself. He was not a polished staff officer. He was rough, blunt, hard. He smoked constantly. He coughed constantly. He swore like a street brawler. But he understood one thing perfectly. A conventional defense would fail. If the Germans were allowed to bring their full-power artillery, tanks, air support onto open Soviet positions, the city would fall in days. So Chukov made a decision that would define the battle. He ordered his men to get as close to the Germans as possible, to cling to them, to be so close that German artillery and air support could not be used without hitting their own troops. He called it hugging the enemy. There would be no neat defensive lines, no noble, ordered withdrawals. There would be only one kind of war. A war fought room to room, floor to floor, over staircases, hallways, chimneys, factory machines, and piles of shattered brick. A rat's war. The Germans came into Stalingrad confident. Paulus's 6th Army had crushed everything in its path. The Soviet retreats of 1941 and early 1942 had given them the impression of an enemy that would always break under pressure. From their viewpoint on the western approaches, Stalingrad looked already defeated, smoking, devastated, torn open by bombing. Many officers believed the battle would be simple. They were wrong. The moment they entered the city, everything changed. Tanks struggled to move through streets clogged with rubble. Snipers watched every open space. Machine gun nests in basements chewed up advancing infantry. A ruined factory wall that looked abandoned from a distance concealed an entire platoon. A pile of bricks turned out to be a carefully prepared position. A warehouse, its roof blown away, housed mortars that struck with uncanny precision. Every ruin was a fortress, every basement a trench, every broken staircase a cliff to be taken. The Germans had come to fight a war of maneuver. Instead, they walked into a maze. On the ground, the fighting quickly became personal. In one shattered apartment block near the city center, a squad of Soviet soldiers under a young lieutenant named Sokolov held the upper floors. German troops had taken the ground level. The building groaned with every nearby explosion. They could hear each other. Footsteps, coughs, the click of a rifle bolt. The distance between them was sometimes no more than a wooden floor and a thin layer of plaster. They fought by drilling holes through walls and tossing grenades through them, by firing through ceilings, by crawling out windows and back in through others. One day, the Germans attacked up the stairwell. They came fast, shouting, grenades bouncing off steps. Sokolov's men fell back to the landing, throwing their own grenades down the stairs. The blast echoed like thunder in the confined space. The air filled with dust and screams. When the dust cleared, the stairwell was a twisted spiral of blood and broken wood. Bodies lay in unnatural angles. The Germans did not take the building that day, or the next, or the day after, but they kept trying. Sokolov watched his squad shrink day by day. No one wrote their names down. No one would remember this staircase when people later spoke of Stalingrad. But here, in this shaft of broken concrete, part of the battle was being decided. Not in sweeping maneuvers and arrows on maps, but in steps, bullets, grenades, and breaths. Snipers became ghosts that haunted the ruins. Among the Soviet defenders was a young man from the Urals named Vasily Zaitsev, a shepherd-turned-hunter-turned-soldier. He had learned to shoot wolves at long distances in the mountains. In Stalingrad, he hunted officers, machine gunners, observers, anyone who could tilt the balance of a small battle. He hid among beams, in shattered attics, under twisted girders. He knew the way light shifted over the city during the day. He knew where officers liked to stand. He knew how to be patient. A German would stand up to signal. One shot, a silent fall. The Germans began to fear doorways, windows, and even looking over sandbags. In their reports, they called the unseen marksmen ghosts. In Stalingrad, death often came from nowhere. Across the Volga, reinforcements continued to cross under fire. At night, the river was a black mirror broken by streaks of tracer fire and the flashes of exploding shells. Boats full of soldiers, ammunition, medical supplies, and food tried to navigate through it. Sometimes they made it, sometimes they did not. Many men never even set foot on the western bank. They died in the cold water. Anonymous, their bodies swept downstream. Those who reached the city were thrown into combat almost immediately. No time for rest. No time to learn the streets. They were told, hold this building. Retake that factory. Do not let the Germans reach the river. Over time, the front line moved closer and closer to the Volga. In some places, only a few hundred meters separated the Germans from the water, but they never quite reached it, because every time they advanced, someone stood in the way. A half-starved soldier with a rifle, a machine gunner with one functioning belt of ammunition, a sniper with 3 bullets, a woman throwing Molotov cocktails from a ruined wall, a group of workers who had picked up weapons after their machines were destroyed. Stalingrad was not defended only by soldiers. It was defended by everyone left alive. Winter began to creep in. It came first as a chill in the mornings, then as frost on twisted iron, then as a cold wind that cut through uniforms and boots already worn thin. The Volga began to ice along the banks, a thin skin at first, then thicker. Snow dusted the ruins, coating shattered bricks and corpses alike. The city looked almost peaceful from a distance, still, quiet. But beneath that thin layer of white, Stalingrad was rotting with unburied bodies, with spilled blood, with the stink of burned flesh and wasted food. Rats multiplied, disease lurked in the shadows, and still, the fighting did not stop. The Germans believed the cold would break the Soviets. They forgot that the cold had made them. By the end of the first months of fighting, no one in Stalingrad remembered what the city had looked like before the bombings. Memory blurred. There had always been ruins. There had always been smoke. There had always been bodies in the streets. Men forgot weeks. They lived hour to hour, from one bombardment to the next. From one building to the next, sleep became a rumor, food a miracle, water a treasure. But one thing remained sharp in their minds. The Germans could not be allowed to reach the Volga, because if the Volga fell, so might the country. So they held, not because they believed in slogans or speeches. They held because there was nowhere else to go, because their friends had died on these streets, because this ruined place of smoke and frost and broken stone had become, in some twisted way, home. The city that once had been just a name on a map had become something else, a line drawn in rubble, ash, and blood. This far, no further. And as the winter wind howled through the skeletons of buildings, both armies dug in, preparing for the next phase of the battle. The phase where not just the city, but an entire army would be trapped. Where Stalingrad would stop being a front line and become a grave. Winter did not arrive gently in Stalingrad. It slammed into the city like a hammer, cold, brutal, merciless. The wind cut through the ruins like a blade, carrying with it the smell of smoke, cordite, and frozen corpses. In November 1942, the frost gripped the Volga so fiercely that the river itself seemed to cry out in pain, cracking under the weight of ice. The water darkened, swirling in angry currents beneath the forming crust. For the Soviet soldiers, this cold was familiar. For the Germans, it was a slow death. Boots hardened and split. Fingers blackened. Machines froze. Engines refused to start. Fuel thickened like syrup. Bread froze so solid that knives snapped trying to cut it. And all the while, the city continued to devour men. The German advance stalls General Paulus's 6th Army had marched to Stalingrad with confidence, speed, and firepower. They had crossed hundreds of miles. They had crushed dozens of Soviet units. But Stalingrad was different. Every block cost blood. Every building cost hours. Every street was a battlefield. And now winter pinned them down. Their supply lines stretched thin across the steppes. Their winter clothing never arrived. Their ammunition dwindled, their rations shrank. Hitler demanded they continue the assault. "There is to be no retreat," he ordered. "You must take Stalingrad. You must break the Soviet defenders." But for the soldiers on the ground, it felt less like war and more like starvation with bullets. The Soviets prepare something huge across the Volga. The Soviet command had not been idle. Men, tanks, artillery, and ammunition had been massing quietly along the northern and southern flanks of the German advance. Far from the ruined city, far from German eyes, an army was gathering. 2 armies, in fact. The southwestern front to the north, the Stalingrad front to the south. Both waited for the same word, Operation Uranus. A massive counterattack designed not to push the Germans away from the city, but to encircle them inside it. Berlin believed the Soviets were nearly defeated. They did not expect the Red Army to strike with overwhelming force. In late November, the trap snapped shut. The northern blow on the morning of November 19th, the northern steppe shook with the force of hundreds of Soviet guns firing at once. The horizon flashed red. The earth trembled under the onslaught. Soviet T-34s surged forward through snow-laden fields, their thick armor shedding bullets like rain. Infantry followed behind in swarms, Siberian troops by winters far worse than this. Their target was not the German 6th Army, but the weaker Romanian units holding the flanks. Brave as the Romanian soldiers were, they were outmatched. Their anti-tank guns could not pierce the T-34s. Their trenches lacked proper winter fortifications. Their lines shattered like glass. Within hours, the Soviet spearhead had carved through miles of Romanian positions. A German officer later wrote, "It was as if the earth split open and poured out endless masses of Russians." The Southern Hammer one day later, on November 20th, the Southern Soviet force struck. Here, too, the Germans had entrusted part of their flanks to Romanian troops, believing they could hold until winter passed. But the Soviets hit with brutal precision tanks, artillery, infantry, and cavalry units charging across frozen plains. The Romanian lines bent, then buckled, then broke completely. German units attempted to rush forward to stabilize the front, but they were too far away and too few in number. The Soviet pincer began to close. Paulus doesn't understand. Yet inside Stalingrad, General Paulus was still obsessed with the fighting in the city. His reports fixated on seizing the tractor factory, the barricade factory, the chemical plant, the riverbank. He believed the Soviets were pouring everything into holding the city. He did not grasp what was happening outside it. He did not know until too late that the Soviet attack was not meant to free the city, but to trap him inside it. The two fronts meet between November 22nd and 23rd, the northern and southern Soviet armies toward each other across the frozen steppe. German and Romanian remnants tried desperately to stop them, but the Soviets were moving too fast. Then, near the town of Kalak, a Soviet tank column burst through the last thin German screen and made contact with the southern spearhead. North met south. East met west. The ring closed. The German 6th Army, over 250,000 men, was now trapped, encircled, cut off from supplies, reinforcements, fuel, and hope. A massive pocket of German forces, stretched across Stalingrad and the surrounding area, suddenly found themselves behind enemy lines. A Soviet soldier wrote in his diary, "We have caught a giant in a steel cage." The German reaction, chaos. When the encirclement became clear, panic spread through German high command. Some officers begged to break out. Others urged holding the pocket until relief arrived. Paulus hesitated, torn between the reality on the ground and the orders from his Führer. Then came the message from Hitler. "The 6th Army will stay in Stalingrad. It will hold its ground. I will send supplies by air. Not one man will leave Stalingrad." Generals stared at the message in disbelief. Air supply? Through blizzards? Through Soviet anti-aircraft fire? With too few planes? With Soviet lines tightening every day? It was impossible. But Hitler did not know the meaning of impossible, or refused to accept it. The order stood, no retreat. The cage remained closed. Starvation begins by early December. Rations inside the pocket had reached critical levels. The daily bread issue shrank. Canned food was rationed. Horses were slaughtered. Soup became cloudy water with a handful of barley or a scrap of frozen meat. German soldiers wrote in their diaries, "We are eating our future strength. We dream of bread. My hands are shaking from hunger." Frostbite ravaged fingers. Trenches froze. Medicines ran out. Fuel was exhausted. The wounded lay in unheated rooms, blankets stiff with blood, breath rising in thin clouds. Some froze during the night, their bodies stiff in the morning light. The German 6th Army was dying slowly. The Volga takes the dead. The Volga still ran dark, cold, slow. Bodies were thrown onto the ice, sometimes alone, sometimes in piles, sometimes wrapped, sometimes not. The river held them until the ice cracked and swallowed them whole. One Soviet soldier wrote, "The Volga eats the dead. In spring it will give them back." Chuikov strikes back inside the ruins of Stalingrad. General Chukov sensed the shift. The defenders became attackers little by little. Snipers hunted more boldly. Assault groups raided German positions at night, killing silently with knives and grenades. Factories became battlegrounds where Soviet shock troops crawled through pipes, machines, and broken walls to strike without warning. Morale rose. The feeling spread like fire. The Germans are trapped. They cannot escape. Now they will be the ones who starve. Stalingrad's children of Ruin, the streets were filled with children. Some scavenged among rubble for scraps of burnt bread. Some carried messages for Soviet units. Some crawled through drains to spy on German positions. One boy, barely 11, delivered hot tea to Soviet snipers in the chemical plant ruins. He ran bent low, darting between shattered walls. One morning he didn't return. They found him lying face down in the snow, teacups scattered around him, his coat soaked red. The sniper who had been waiting for him climbed down from his perch. He carried the boy's body to a ruin and buried him with his own hands. War turned everyone into someone else. The pocket shrinks. December turned to January. The cold grew worse. Food grew scarcer. Ammunition dwindled. The pocket shrank day by day under Soviet pressure. German officers measured the front line not in kilometers, but in streets, buildings, even rooms. One factory became a battlefield for 3 weeks. A single apartment block cost 2,000 lives. A railway embankment became a frozen graveyard of machines. Still, Paulus refused to break out. Still, Hitler forbade retreat. Still, the men held their positions. but their strength was fading. Some soldiers collapsed from hunger during battle. Others drifted into delirium, imagining warm food and soft beds. Frostbite took toes, fingers, ears. In some units, more men died from cold and starvation than from bullets. The German Sixth Army, once a force feared across Europe, was now a shadow of itself. A starving ghost. The Soviet Cummins a deal in January. The Soviets sent an ultimatum to Paulus. Surrender. You are surrounded. You cannot escape. Your men are dying. Paulus read the message. He considered it. Then Hitler's order arrived. Surrender is forbidden. Between saving his men and obeying the Führer, Paulus chose obedience. The battle would continue. The dying would continue. The final winter, by late January, temperatures fell to 30 C. The wind howled down ruined corridors and through broken factory walls. Snow buried trenches and corpses alike. Inside the pocket, German soldiers burned furniture to stay warm. They tore pages from manuals to start fires. They burned crates, wheels, even ammunition boxes. But wood burns fast, too fast, and there was not enough of it. Men huddled around dying fires, singing songs that broke into coughing. Some whispered prayers, others stared blankly at nothing. The Soviets watched from their lines. They saw their enemy rotting. But they did not pity them. Too much had been done. Too much blood had been spilled. Stalingrad had become a place where mercy froze before reaching the heart. The winter of 1943 did not simply arrive in Stalingrad. It claimed the city. It seeped into the bones of every soldier. It froze the breath in the air. It coated the ruins with a thin white shroud. And beneath that shroud lay tens of thousands of bodies, German, Soviet, civilian, entombed in ice. The battlefield smelled of nothing anymore. Even rot froze in Stalingrad. The only things alive were the wind, the hunger, and the dying. The great squeeze. By late January, the pocket had collapsed into a series of shrinking islands of resistance. The German Sixth Army was no longer one unified force. It was fragments, broken regiments, scattered battalions, starving companies. Each fought in isolation, surrounded by Soviet forces tightening like a fist. The Chekhov line, as the Germans called it, advanced meter by meter. Not kilometers, meters. German positions that had once held hundreds now held dozens. Streets once defended by entire divisions now saw only a handful of frostbitten soldiers crouched behind rubble. Their weapons froze. Their fingers cracked and bled. Their eyes grew hollow. The Sixth Army was becoming what the Soviets called it, the Army of Shadows. The end of medical hope in basement hospitals, really just pits with blankets. The wounded lay in rows on frozen floors. Some groaned. Some prayed. Many no longer had the strength for either. Doctors amputated limbs without anesthetic. Morphine had run out weeks ago. Bandages were washed and reused until they were more blood than cloth. A German surgeon named Dr. Weber worked from before dawn until long after dark, though day and night meant little in Stalingrad. His hands cracked from cold, his uniform stiff from dried blood. One night, a young soldier was carried in, shaking violently. His leg was blackened from frostbite. Weber examined it and whispered, "It must come off, now." The boy nodded weakly. As Weber prepared, the boy reached into his coat and pulled out a small photograph, a smiling girl, maybe 16, standing in a field of tall grass. "My sister," he whispered. Tell her I tried." Weber froze. He had no way to tell her anything. He placed the photo on the boy's chest. The surgery began. The boy screamed until he fainted. The next morning he was dead. Weber kept the photograph. The black snow fell constantly now, but it was never white. Ash from burned buildings mixed with it. Soot from artillery explosions darkened it. Oil from wrecked tanks stained it. People called it the black snow. It coated soldiers' faces, collected in their eyelashes, clung to their uniforms. When they licked their lips, they tasted bitterness and metal. A German officer wrote in his diary, his last entry, "The sky no longer gives us snow. It gives us the ashes of the dead." The airlift failure. Hitler had promised the Sixth Army would be supplied by air. It was a fantasy. The Luftwaffe tried. Planes flew into a storm of Soviet fire, blizzards, and engine failures. Every day, some planes crashed, some were shot down, some simply vanished over the steppe. Even when they succeeded, they brought nowhere near enough supplies. A single German soldier needed 300 grams of bread per day. Most received 50. Some received nothing. Planes meant to carry ammunition instead carried bread. Planes meant to evacuate the wounded instead evacuated officers. Sometimes crates dropped by parachute drifted into Soviet lines, feeding the enemy instead. The Sixth Army starved while the skies roared uselessly overhead. Dead walk. By mid-January, starvation had become so severe that soldiers began to hallucinate. Some spoke to people who weren't there. Some wandered into the snow, claiming to see warm homes or lights. Others stood still for hours, staring at walls as if expecting them to speak. One soldier, delirious with hunger, was seen trying to eat a frozen boot. Another tried to chew paper. A third was caught boiling old leather belts for soup. Not everyone stayed sane. An NCO shot himself in front of his men, leaving no note. A junior officer stripped naked in the cold, claiming he was burning, and froze to death within minutes. An entire squad surrendered to a single Soviet scout because they thought he was an angel. The mind collapses long before the body. The Soviets see the ghosts on the Soviet side. Soldiers watched the Germans fall apart. They saw skeletal figures dragging themselves between rubble piles. They saw wounded men crawling on hands and knees begging for water. They saw soldiers who didn't even raise their rifles when confronted. One Soviet corporal wrote, "We stopped shooting some of them. They were no longer soldiers. They were shadows." But pity was rare. Most Soviets remembered burned villages, murdered families, starvation, humiliation. They remembered seeing their homeland ravaged. For them, Stalingrad was justice. The failed relief attempt. Hitler promised the trapped army, "Field Marshal Manstein will save you." Manstein, a brilliant commander, attempted a relief operation, Operation Winter Storm. His tanks advanced across the frozen steppe, pushing hard against Soviet lines. For a moment, hope flickered. But Paulus did not break out to meet them. He refused, or rather, Hitler forbade it. "Hold Stalingrad," he ordered again. "Relief will come." Manstein's force stalled. Soviet counterattacks drove it back. The hope died. The pocket tightened. The German Sixth Army realized they were not being saved. They were being sacrificed. The last Christmas 1942 came to Stalingrad like a cruel joke. Some soldiers sang quietly. Some prayed. Others simply lay in the snow and waited to die. A chaplain held a small service in a bombed-out cellar. He had no candles, no cross, no Bible. He spoke only with his voice. When he finished, a soldier whispered, "Father, is God in Stalingrad?" The chaplain looked at the ruins, the bodies, the black snow. He answered, "Not tonight." Eating the dead. There are stories from Stalingrad that even historians hesitate to print. Stories whispered in diaries and survivor accounts. Stories of starvation so severe that men scraped frost from corpses to drink water. Soldiers boiled snow with human bone fragments. Some cut flesh from the dead. Not murder, not violence, desperation. A German medic found two soldiers roasting meat over a tiny fire. He asked where they got it. They remained silent. He did not ask again. Stalingrad was not a battlefield anymore. It was a famine with guns. January collapse. By mid-January 1943, the pocket had split into two. The southern pocket, Paulus's headquarters at the Univermag department store. The northern pocket, the tractor factory and barricade factory ruins. Communication between them was nearly impossible. The Soviets attacked relentlessly, knowing the Germans had no reserves. Every hour brought new losses. Every street fell. Every strongpoint died. German officers began burning maps and documents. Some burned their medals. Some burned diaries so their families would never read the truth. Paulus sent one last message to Hitler. We can no longer hold. Our men cannot fight. They have no food, no ammunition. Hitler responded, fight to the last bullet. Paulus dropped the paper in disgust. He knew what Hitler really meant. Die there. The final day's frostbite, starvation, exhaustion, shelling, collapse. The Germans were falling like leaves. A unit of 200 men began the day. By evening, only 14 remained. Another company, ordered to counterattack, refused. A captain shouted, "Attack where? With what? Against whom? We don't even have grenades." Some officers tried to restore discipline. Others broke down completely. A colonel shot himself when he learned relief would never come. A sergeant with frostbitten hands wept quietly as he tried to load his rifle. The Soviets bombarded from all sides. The pocket shrank to a few city blocks. The Volga, once a wide escape route, was now death. Still, Paulus hesitated to surrender. Still, Hitler demanded resistance. Still, men died. The final week of January 1943 came to Stalingrad like a slow suffocation. The cold did not break. The hunger did not ease. The shells did not stop. But something else changed, something worse. Hope died. It didn't die in an explosion or a final act of defiance. It died quietly. It died in the eyes of the men. A kind of emptiness settled over the German Sixth Army, a hollow silence, the look of men who had finally understood. No one is coming. No one will save us. We will die here. And with that realization, the army began to fall apart, not from Soviet bullets, but from within. The army unravels. The Sixth Army had once been a precise instrument of war, disciplined, efficient, unstoppable. Now it was a collection of exhausted, starving ghosts. Command structures disintegrated. Orders arrived too late or never arrived at all. Officers no longer knew where their men were. Men no longer knew who their officers were. Entire battalions simply vanished, dissolved into the ruins. Some froze to death in their foxholes. Some wandered away in delirium. Some were buried under collapsing buildings. Some simply lay down in the snow and stopped moving. One soldier wrote in his diary, "We are not soldiers anymore. We are snow drifting in the wind." The last supplies by January 25th, the airlift had practically collapsed. The Luftwaffe lost more than 500 aircraft trying to supply Stalingrad. Those that survived were damaged or grounded. Only a handful of Ju-52s made it through the Soviet TA fire each day. And when they did, they sometimes ammunition instead of food, sometimes spare parts instead of medicine, sometimes nothing but despair at Potomnik Airfield. The Sixth Army's last functioning runway. Chaos ruled. Thousands of wounded soldiers dragged themselves to the airfield, hoping for evacuation. They crawled. They stumbled. Some were carried by comrades who could barely walk themselves, but only a few dozen per day made it onto the plains. The rest froze or starved in the snow. When Potomnik fell to the Soviets on January 16th, the last hope of evacuation vanished. The wounded left behind screamed as Soviet tanks rolled in. Some soldiers begged to be shot. Some were crushed trying to crawl onto the last departing aircraft. A German officer wrote, "When Potomnik fell, we all fell with it." The Soviets tightened the news. The Soviets advanced with grim determination. They no longer used massive bombardments. They no longer wasted artillery on ruins already shattered. They moved methodically, block by block, burning out every pocket of resistance. Their tactics were brutal but efficient. Flamethrowers to clear basements, grenades down stairwells, machine gun bursts into any suspicious hole, tanks smashing through walls, snipers picking off anyone who moved. They did not rush. They advanced like surgeons, cutting out a tumor. Soviet soldiers knew that every day they held back would mean more German attempts at breakout, more airlifts, more suffering for their own troops. So they kept pushing. A Soviet commander said, "We will grind them until nothing is left to grind." The last radio messages, German radio operators kept desperate messages at all hours. Most went unanswered. One transmission from a surrounded regiment read, "We are surrounded, ammunition gone, wounded everywhere. What are your orders?" No reply. Another message, "We have eaten our last horse. We have no more fuel. Our weapons are frozen. We cannot move." Silence. Finally, a message sent directly to Paulus's headquarters. "Why do you not answer? Why do you not help us? We are your men." Paulus stared at that message for a long time. He had nothing to say. The madness, as the pocket further, madness took hold. Soldiers fought over pieces of frozen bread. Some turned on their own comrades. Some fired their last bullets at shadows. Some sang songs loudly, hysterically, refusing to stop. A group of officers held a final dinner in a frozen basement. A single candle, a bottle of schnapps, and a loaf of moldy bread they cut into 6 equal pieces. To Germany. One officer began to laugh. He didn't stop. He laughed until tears froze on his cheeks. He laughed until his comrades dragged him away. Another soldier, delirious from hunger, walked into Soviet lines wearing only his greatcoat. He approached a startled Soviet sentry, saluted, and said, "The war is over. We can all go home now." The sentry stared at him, confused. Then he whispered, "Yes, for you it is." The children of the city, Soviet troops advancing through the ruins, often found civilians hiding in cellars, mostly women, old men, and children. One Soviet squad entered a collapsed apartment block and found a group of children huddled around a fire of burning books. Their faces were gaunt, eyes hollow. A boy of around 10 stepped forward, hands shaking. "Please, do not shoot," he whispered. The Soviet sergeant, hardened by years of war, felt something in his chest. He tore his ration into pieces and handed it to the children. "Eat," he said. "You survived the worst." One girl burst into tears. The others ate silently. War creates monsters. But sometimes, in rare moments, it reminds men they are still human. The North Pocket falls on January 28th. The Soviets overran the Northern Pocket, the factories, the worker districts, the trenches leading toward the Volga. What remained of the 6th Army withdrew toward the city center. Paulus's men were now compressed into a tiny area around the Univermag department store, a single square kilometer of ruins. The Soviets could stand on rooftops and see the entire German perimeter. A Soviet officer wrote, "They are not an army anymore, only clusters of wounded in holes." Hitler makes Paulus a field marshal on January 30th. Hitler received reports that Paulus was considering surrender. Outraged, Hitler promoted him on the spot to field marshal, the highest rank in the German army. No German field marshal had ever surrendered. They were expected to kill themselves rather than fall into enemy hands. Hitler's message was clear: die in Stalingrad. Paulus understood. He stared at the promotion notification. He crumpled it in his hand. He turned to his staff and said bitterly, "I will not kill myself for Hitler." The room fell silent. In that moment, the German 6th Army died in spirit. The final assault, on January 31st, the Soviets launched their final attack on the Southern Pocket. Tanks rolled forward through smoke-filled streets. Infantry cleared every room, every basement, every ruined cellar. German resistance was minimal. Most soldiers dropped their weapons and raised their hands. Others simply lay in the snow, too weak to stand. Paulus's headquarters was in the basement of the Univermag store, cold, dim, crowded with wounded men lying on the floor. When Soviet troops entered the building, Paulus did not resist. He had no strength left to do so. He stood pale and exhausted as the Soviet officer approached. "I am Colonel General Paulus," he said. The Soviet officer nodded slowly. "Field Marshal Paulus, your war is over." Paulus lowered his eyes. It was over long ago. The end of the South Pocket. By the evening of January 31st, the entire Southern Pocket surrendered. But the Northern Pocket, commanded by General Karl Strecker, refused. For 2 more days, Strecker's men fought a hopeless, starving, impossible battle. They held on to ruins not because they believed they could win, but because they believed surrender was dishonorable. On February 2nd, with ammunition gone and only 4,000 men left alive, Strecker finally radioed the Soviets. "We surrender." The Battle of Stalingrad was over. Stalingrad did not grow quiet after the guns fell silent. Silence never returned to that place. Only a different kind of sound, the wind blowing through ruins full of dead men and the shuffling of thousands of survivors who no longer knew if they were among the living or the dead. The battle had ended. The suffering had not. When the Soviets collected the German prisoners, the remnants of the once mighty Sixth Army, they found not soldiers, but skeletons dressed in tattered uniforms. They had sunken cheeks, hollow eyes, bones showing through skin. Their boots were worn through, their coats patched with rags, many barefoot in the frozen snow. Some carried rifles without bolts. Some leaned on sticks. Some had to be carried by others. This was not an army surrendering. It was a population of ghosts. A city of the dead. Before moving the prisoners, the Soviets first had to secure the ruins. What they found, even they, hardened by years of war, were not ready for. In factories, frozen bodies lay piled like logs. In houses, families sat around stoves long gone cold, still in the positions they died in. In cellars, soldiers sat upright against walls, their eyes open, their bodies stiff. One Soviet officer recorded, "We found a machine gun nest with 3 Germans inside, all dead, frozen solid, still holding their weapon." In a ruined apartment block, a Soviet patrol found a young German soldier lying on a bed, hands folded neatly on his chest. Beside him lay a small diary. The last line read, "I am so tired of being hungry." The roundup. Once the Soviets finished taking the city, they began gathering prisoners. Many Germans came out of ruins voluntarily, holding white cloths on sticks. Some crawled. Some were too weak to speak. Others offered their weapons with trembling hands. A Soviet sergeant, seeing the state of the prisoners, muttered, "These are not the men who invaded us." A lieutenant beside him replied, "But they are the men who burned our homes." There was no mercy in Stalingrad. There was no cruelty without reason either. The Soviets treated the prisoners with cold efficiency, not kindness. They had seen too much to offer kindness. The first march, the Soviet commanders ordered the prisoners to march to collection points outside the city. Some distances were short, a few kilometers. Others were 30, even 40 kilometers through open, frozen steppe. The Germans began walking, their legs trembling under them. For many, the march was the last thing they would ever do. The weak collapsed in snow. Some were beaten to their feet. Those who could not rise were left behind. They froze within minutes. A German officer tried to encourage his men. "Keep walking. Just a little more." A private looked at him with empty eyes. "Sir, I haven't eaten in 9 days." The officer had no answer. The column of shadows, one Soviet unit, watched a column of prisoners pass by, thousands of them, walking in silence. No one talked. No one looked up. They stared at the ground, dragging their feet, swaying like reeds in the wind. A Soviet corporal wrote, "It was as if death itself was marching." Some prisoners whispered to themselves, delirious, "I am warm, I am warm." Moments later, they fell to the ground unconscious. Others tried to sing to keep their spirits alive, but the songs faded after a few notes. The snow was dotted with bodies that had fallen out of the line. The Soviets did not stop to bury them. Stalingrad buried itself. Paulus' taken away. Field Marshal Paulus, newly captured, was transported separately. He was not beaten. He was not stripped. He was not killed. The Soviets knew he was more valuable alive. When a Soviet officer offered him food, Paulus stared at it for a long time before saying, "My men starve and you offer me bread?" The officer replied, "You are not a soldier anymore. You are a prisoner. Paulus took the bread slowly, but he did not eat in front of his captors. He waited until they left. Even then, he ate only half. The other half he wrapped carefully and saved for later. Even a field marshal had learned to fear hunger. The long road east, prisoners were loaded into trains, not cushioned, heated cars, but open cattle wagons. Dozens were packed into each one. The doors were shut. The temperature was below 20 C. Frost formed on the inside of the walls. Breath turned to ice on beards and collars. Men huddled together for warmth. Some froze sitting upright. Others starved during the journey. When the trains stopped, Soviet soldiers opened the doors. Those who were alive stumbled out like blind men. Those who were dead remained sitting. Sometimes they had to be pulled out with iron hooks, frozen stiff, fused to the walls. A Soviet guard wrote, "I never imagined I would pity a German, but hunger makes all men equal." The prisoners were taken to various camps throughout the Soviet Union, in the Urals, Siberia, Kazakhstan, and Central Asia. Most were not death camps. They were labor camps. But for men already half dead, labor camp might as well mean the same thing. Work was brutal. Cutting timber, digging coal, building railroads, repairing roads, mining stone, carrying supplies. Food was minimal. Thin soup, black bread, salted fish. When available in winter, men worked in snow up to their knees. In summer, they worked in swarms of insects under burning sun. Many collapsed and never stood again. Out of the 91,000 Axis soldiers captured at Stalingrad, only about 5,000 ever returned home. The rest died of starvation, disease, frost, exhaustion, beatings, hopelessness, a German survivor later wrote. Stalingrad did not end with surrender. Stalingrad ended when the last of us stopped dreaming. Friendships in hell, yet even in camps, some moments of humanity survived. A Soviet guard shared his bread with a German prisoner who reminded him of his own son. A German officer taught Russian prisoners chess, using carved stones as pieces. A Soviet nurse tended to a dying German soldier, whispering, "My brother died in this war. But you are someone's brother too." Humanity flickered like a weak candle in a storm, but it never fully went out. The return of spring, when spring finally arrived in 1943, the snow melted and revealed the true horror of Stalingrad. Bodies thawed. Weapons emerged from icy tombs. Pockets of frozen blood turned dark. The Volga released corpses that had sunk months earlier. Some floated. Some were tangled in barbed wire. Some still clutched weapons. The smell was overwhelming. It lingered for months. But life began to return. Grass pushed through cracked streets. Trees sprouted new leaves. Birds returned to nests built in the ruins. The city was not alive, but it refused to stay dead. A fighter one day, a Soviet soldier cleaning rubble, found a frozen German corpse leaning against a wall. The man's hands were clasped around a small piece of paper. A letter. It read, "My dearest Anna, if you ever read this, know that I fought as long as I could, not for Hitler, not for glory, but because I was afraid. I think of you every day. I see your face when I close my eyes. Forgive me for leaving you alone. Your Johann." The Soviet soldier folded the letter gently and placed it back on the man's chest. He whispered, "Sleep now, Johann. It's over." The white of Stalingrad, the battle had ended, but its weight would crush Europe for generations. Germany lost, 750,000 men killed, wounded, 22 divisions wiped out, the aura of invincibility shattered. The Soviet Union lost hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civilians. The city was destroyed. Entire families erased, children orphaned. A generation scarred. Stalingrad became more than a battle. It became a symbol of suffering, a symbol of endurance, a symbol of the moment the tide of war changed forever. Because in the ashes of the city, something new grew, the belief that the Nazi war machine could be stopped. And it began here. In this graveyard of steel and bone, in this frozen hell, In this place where humanity was buried but never completely lost. Stalingrad did not end when the guns fell silent, nor when Paulus surrendered, nor when the last pockets of German resistance were crushed under Soviet boots. The battle ended on paper, yes, but its wounds stayed open for decades. A city does not simply recover from becoming the graveyard of armies. A nation does not simply forget a wound carved into its soul, and the men who survived did not return the same men they were before. Stalingrad was not a battle. It was a transformation. A turning of the earth so violent that it changed the shape of the world. The last prisoners, after months of starvation and forced labor, only a fraction of the German prisoners remained alive. The march to the camps, the cold of the steppes, the hunger, the disease, all took their toll. By the end of 1943, tens of thousands had died in the first months alone. By 1944, only a few thousand were left. By 1945, still. Devastated by the cruelty of the German occupation, saw the prisoners not as men, but as tools to rebuild a nation shattered by invasion. The prisoners were put to work building railways, roads, bridges, power plants, factories. They worked until their hands bled, until their lungs burned from coal dust, until their backs bent under the weight of timber and stone. Some collapsed on the road and never rose again. Some simply closed their eyes at night and did not wake. The return home, years later. It wasn't until 1955, 10 years after the end of the war, that the last German prisoners were allowed to return home. Many were unrecognizable. Skin stretched thin over bones, eyes sunken, hair grayed or gone, voices weak. They returned to families who thought them dead. In one town in West Germany, a woman waited at a train station for a husband she hadn't seen in 12 years. When he stepped off the train, she didn't recognize him. He approached her slowly, saying her name. She fainted. In another village, a child of 10 met the father he had never known. The man knelt and said, "I am your papa." The child, confused, whispered, "You're too thin," and touched his face as if to confirm he was real. Some prisoners returned home to nothing, their towns destroyed, their families gone, their lives erased by time. Some never returned at all. Stalingrad had taken them, and the Volga had kept them. The fate of the Commanders Paulus Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus lived the rest of his life in captivity in the Soviet Union. He refused to commit suicide, refused to return to Nazi Germany, refused to serve Hitler ever again. After the war, he testified against the Nazi regime in Nuremberg. He lived quietly in East Germany until 1957. He died in Dresden, a broken man physically and spiritually. He never escaped the shadow of Stalingrad. Zhukov General Vasily Zhukov, the brutal but brilliant commander of the Soviet 62nd Army, survived the war, became a marshal of the Soviet Union, and lived to be an old man. When he died, he requested one thing: to be buried in Stalingrad, where my soldiers fell. His grave lies today on the hill overlooking the city, the same hill where so many died in the final days of the battle. Hitler, the defeat at Stalingrad, shattered the myth of Nazi invincibility. Hitler raged, shouted, accused his generals of cowardice, blamed everyone but himself. 2 years later, with the Red Army closing in on Berlin, he hid in his bunker and ended his life with a pistol. His empire fell. His ideology died. The man who dreamed of destroying nations had been undone by a single city on the Volga. The city, reborn Stalingrad, was more than destroyed. It was annihilated. Of its 600,000 inhabitants, fewer than 10,000 remained alive by the time the battle ended. Entire districts had been erased. Streets were unrecognizable. Foundations were shattered. Buildings were skeletons. Yet the city refused to die. With the end of the war, the Soviets began rebuilding, brick by brick, beam by beam, house by house. Women, children, old men, soldiers, all worked together. The city rose slowly from its ashes. The factories reopened. The docks were rebuilt. New neighborhoods grew where craters had been. The city was renamed Volgograd in 1961, but to the world it would always be Stalingrad. The memory of Stalingrad today, Stalingrad is more than a battlefield. It is a memorial, a symbol, a warning. On the hill overlooking the city stands The Motherland Calls, a colossal statue of a woman with a sword raised high, screaming for her sons to defend their land. Beneath her feet lie thousands of graves, rows upon rows of markers, names and nameless dead, all part of the same story. Visitors walk the quiet park and hear only the wind. The ghosts of the past whisper in every stone, every step, every breath. A plaque reads, "Here, the fate of the world was decided." And it was. The white on the world's Stalingrad changed everything. It broke the Wehrmacht's spine. It shattered Hitler's illusion of invincibility. It shifted the momentum of the war. It lifted the morale of every allied nation. It proved that even the greatest war machine could be stopped. It set the stage for the Soviet advance toward Berlin. Millions died because of decisions made in rooms far from the front lines. But millions lived because a city refused to surrender. Stalingrad is the story of human endurance, endurance at its most heroic and its most tragic. The final scene on a cold spring day, years after the war, a Soviet veteran returned to the banks of the Volga. He was old now, hands trembling, step unsteady. He stood where the trenches once were, where friends had died, where the city had burned. He whispered, "I didn't think we'd make it, but we did." Then he knelt, touched the soil, and said, "For all of you who stayed here, we remember." And the wind carried his words across the river, across the ruins, across the city reborn, across the graveyard of armies. Stalingrad sleeps beneath the earth, but its story will never sleep, because some battles never end. They live on in the memory of mankind.